that may play a role in the form of genetics and hormones in responses to infants crying. And for a happy end, I thought I'd better end with smiling and laughter, for those are behaviors that babies also display, fortunately. Now, crying, smiling, and babbling are infant behaviors mediating attachment. And they are, in fact, social signals with the predictable outcome of increased proximity of the parent to the child. And that's helpful for your survival. As you may or may not know, John Bowlby, the grandfather of attachment theory, who you see here on the left, also wrote a biography of Charles Darwin, and attachment theory can be seen as an evolutionary theory of human behavior. Attachment behavior increases the chances of children to survive. And that's why it's an evolutionary theory. And in fact, Charles Darwin was also highly interested in the expression of emotions, which is even the title of his third book, written in 1872. It follows on the origin of species and on the descent of man. So you also see in Darwin's work pictures of here crying infants, and later on in this talk I'll also show you some pictures of his of smile and laughter. Tears are quite important. We talk about crocodile tears also in expression. We wonder whether an elephant can cry. And we can distinguish between three types of cry: the basal cry, which is necessary for the lubrication of the eyes; the reflex cry that you may know if you cut onions; and the emotional cry, which is in fact unique for humans. The tears in animals is just the basal cry, the lubrication, or can in some cases also be a reflex cry that you can't inhibit. But not all humans cry with tears. Actually, babies that are born do not cry with tears. They cry aloud, but without tears. And only after a few weeks, they also make tears. So infants are loud criers, but without tears, and adults are quiet criers, but with tears. So the development is from tearless infants crying to soundless adult tears. And with an MRI study, we examined brain activity during the perception of infant and adult tears. In the MRI scanners, participants were exposed to 8 adult photos with tears, 8 without tears, and 8 infant photos with tears and 8 without tears. And they all had a neutral expression, such as the infant faces here. You see on the left hand with tears that we removed, or actually we brought them into the picture. We took the right picture as a basic picture and added tears to it. And then we wondered what the difference in brain reactivity would be to the similar face, but with tears and without tears. And we compared that for infant faces and adult faces. And what we found was that infant tears evoke stronger responses in the visual cortex than adult tears, indicating that infant tears are highly salient, more than adult tears. In addition, our study shows that infant tears uniquely activate somatosensory pain regions, which could stimulate actions directed at the elimination of the source of pain. So shedding tears may be a strong means to elicit the parent sharing of the infant's feelings, thereby strengthening the caregiver-infant bonding and securing infant survival. And that is just specifically for infant tears and not for adult tears. And here you see Madelon Hendricks-Riem, with whom we conducted this study. Now, if you Google infant crying, this is the result that you get. And it struck me, if you see this series of pictures of crying infants, that it's absolutely clear that they are distressed. But what you miss here is seeing the big eyes of children. And the big eyes of children are what is so charming about them, what makes you love them. And the Kindheit phases, the childlike phases, are characterized by big eyes, and you don't see them anymore. So that is a sort of a risk. When an infant cries, you don't see its attractive facial characteristics anymore, and just this loud cry without any eyes open. So that means that the optimum level of adult arousal when exposed to infant cries may be in the middle. If you are not aroused at all, you don't do anything to comfort the baby, and there may be a dangerous situation, so you cannot check his survival. But if you're over-aroused and not charmed anymore by its wide eyes, you may also be triggered to rough handling, to harsh discipline. So in the response to infant crying, the optimum level of adults is in the middle, not too much, not too little. And that's also demonstrated here. This is a graph of the prevalence of shaken baby syndrome in California hospitals. And you see that the peak is at around 12 weeks. And if we look especially at the left-hand side, you see this peak clearly between 2 and 3 months. And that coincides with the cry peak around 2 to 3 months. So early infant crying, when infants cry the most, is also related to the period that most shaken baby syndromes appear to happen. So crying can really trigger harsh parenting and shaken baby syndrome. Now that cry peak is quite normative. We see it in all cultures. What you see from the table here below is that the frequency of cries over the various periods of the infant's age, the first 3 months, then the next 3 months, and then the last 3 months, 7 to 9. The frequency is in various cultures the same, various groups, but the duration is shorter in countries where babies are carried, where there's a lot of physical contact. So it's the same cry peak, but in frequency, but in duration, it is shorter when there's more close physical contact. Now, infants crying and sleep problems are linked, but little is known about the impact of parental responses to crying on infant sleep patterns. And in this Israeli study, married couples were divided into 3 groups, or actually these 3 groups were included. Parents of infants suffering from night waking problems, these are the clinical group. Parents of infants without sleep problems, and childless couples. And participants were shown a video of a crying infant and asked when they would intervene. And what you see here is that parents in the clinical group demonstrated shorter intervention delays in the crying infant clip. So they were less tolerant of infants crying. They sooner thought that they should intervene. And that might, in fact, be related to more sleep problems because the child never learns to be quiet by itself, to regulate its own emotions. And this is not a plea for not reacting to babies, but the best response to infants crying is those that are immediately when there's big distress, big panic, but not too fast when a baby is just settling itself. You also see here that clinical parents tended to attribute more distress to the crying infants compared to the parents in both control groups. And additionally, women demonstrated lower tolerance for infants crying on most measures compared to men. And these results may suggest that parents of sleep-disturbed infants have a lower tolerance of infants crying, which in turn may lead to the development of infant sleep. So in sum, about this first part, the normal crying curve peaks around 2 months of age. There are huge individual differences of crying. The cry curve for cry frequency is universal, but duration might be briefer with physical contact. And parental overarousal may increase crying and might increase sleep problems. If we then come to the second topic, attachment and neuroreactivity to crying, it's good to just in a nutshell repeat what attachment is about. It's about contact and proximity with the goal of comfort and protection. And it does has an evolutionary base. The parent who is wiser and stronger can safeguard the child and assure its survival. And that is why we do not talk about more or less attachment, but about differences in the quality of attachment. For all children have the tendency to establish attachment relationships, but not all children are securely attached. And the quality of attachment is usually measured with the strange situation procedure. That is a procedure where a child is separated twice from the attachment figure. And what is most telling about the attachment relationship is how the child behaves when the attachment figure returns. In an optimal situation, a secure child strikes the balance between a focus on the attachment figure. If he or she is distressed, there is proximity seeking and the child is comforted and then can explore the environment again. So a balance between the attachment figure and exploration of the environment. In about 25% of the cases, children are avoidantly attached. That means they minimize attachment. They do not seek proximity to the caregiver, although from their heart rate and cortisol measures, we know that they are in fact distressed, but they focus on the environment. They continue playing without seeking any proximity. They are minimizing attachment. And around 10% of the children are resistantly attached. They maximize attachment. They do not explore anymore, but are fixated on the attachment figure, even if they do not derive complete comfort from them. There's a fourth category, disorganized attachment. That is the most insecure type that is assigned over and above these avoidant, secure, and resistant attachments, when there's also behavior that shows that there's fright for the parent or inconsistencies in behaviors. Now, I have a brief intermezzo about what it predicts secure attachment and insecure attachment in children, because that is also a way of emotion regulation. And what you see here on the left-hand side is the comparison between B, that is secure children, and non-secure, non-B children. And if you see the dark bar, which reflects social competence, so peer relationships, then this is the meta-analytical effect size over quite a number of studies and very many diets, as you see at the bottom. The effect size of 0.38, so 0.38 of a standard deviation, are secure children more social competent than non-secure children. And to the right of that, externalizing, there's an effect size of 0.21, that is 21 of a standard deviation, that non-B children, insecure children, show more externalizing, and for the dark gray part, also more internalizing problems than secure children. So in terms of emotion regulation, secure children do better than non-secure children. Now, this is a strange situation, and about infants. About 20 years ago, no, more already, 40 years by now, George Kaplan and May developed the adult attachment interview to also assess attachment quality, or actually the representation of attachment, the working model of attachment in adults. And in the adult attachment interview, which is a semi-structured interview about childhood experiences and their influence, adults are asked for general descriptors of childhood attachment relationships, both with the mother and the father, and then also asked for evidence from attachment-related experience. So you say that your mother was warm. Can you remember an incident that your mother was warm? And then in the interview, the participant is also asked for an evaluation of effects on the current personality, and there's a part on traumatic events, loss and maltreatment, and the current relationship with the parents. And in coding the adult attachment interview, the coder uses crisis maxims for coherence. So a secure interview reflects open but contained communication about emotions. So remember this balance of children, of behavior of children in strange situation procedure. The same is true here for adults. So secures strike the balance between being in this interview and focusing on attachment experiences. There are dismissing adults who are insecure, avoidant, independent, who focus completely on the here and now, and say that they don't remember any attachment experiences or say that it did not influence them. They focus on this environment, this interview now. And there are those who are overwhelmed or preoccupied, enmeshed. They lose track of the interview and focus completely on their attachment experiences. It is as if they are in that situation again. And there is the unresolved category that is similar to the disorganized category of children for those who are unresolved about specific loss or traumatic experiences, and it is assigned over and above the other three categories. So we saw that in children, the attachment category could tell us something about their emotion regulation, and we wondered whether the same might be true for adults with a different adult attachment classification in the response to crying. So we wondered, is adult attachment associated with responses to infant crying? We invited women without children, and so that they had the same experience in listening to infant cry sounds, namely not too much. And we administered the AI so that we had our attachment representation, and we made them listening to infant cry sounds. Now, should you have forgotten what an infant cry sound is like, this is what infant crying is like. Now we also manipulated the cry a bit, and let's hear what that is like. What we manipulated was the pitch. This is on a higher pitch, the hertz is higher. And children who have a neural condition or who are sick cry at a higher pitch. And to most adults, this sounds as more, they're more alert. This sounds as more urgent. They feel the urge to react to this higher crying, which makes sense for infants who cry at a higher pitch do need the parent more. It is telling about their health condition. Interestingly, parents with postnatal depression have more difficulty hearing the difference between the two cry sounds. Now, in an fMRI machine, you always also need a control sound to measure the difference in brain activity between the sound you're interested in and a control sound. And this control sound was made by cutting the cry sound in 1,000 pieces and reordering them randomly. And then is this what you hear? So that is the same matched acoustic characteristics, but it lacks the emotional meaning of a cry sound. Well, what did we find? What did we find? We found that those adults with an insecure attachment representation showed more amygdala activation. And amygdala activation is related to anxiety, aversity, and arousal. And we found that for all three insecure attachment categories. So DS, the dismissing, the avoidant, like the E, the overwhelmed, and the unresolved. the F, the free, autonomous, the secures, show the lowest amygdala reactivity to infants crying. Moreover, we asked them in the same session, but outside the scanner, what they felt during infant crying. So we exposed them again to infants crying, and we measured their feelings in terms of irritation. And we also asked them to do the hand grip dynamometer task. Now, some of you may know a hand grip dynamometer. It is well known from fitness centers, and you can squeeze it. And we asked them to squeeze at maximum strength and then at half strength. And participants could see on a screen what their maximum strength was, and then modulate their second strength to half of the first squeeze. And they could train until they could modulate their second squeeze half of the strength from the first. And when they were able to do that, we turned away the screen and they were asked again to do that, squeeze at maximum strength and squeeze at half strength, but now to do that also while exposed to infant cry sounds. And we found that those with an insecure attachment representation reported more irritation during infant crying and more excessive hand grip force. That is, they were not able to modulate their second squeeze to half of the strength of the first squeeze. Of course, everyone has a different baseline, and therefore you set your own baseline in first squeezing at maximum strength and then at half strength. And that is important because this hand grip force has also shown associations with maltreating. When parents cannot modulate their power, they may easily use excessive force, not only with the hand grip, but also with their child. So insecure attachment is related to stronger reactions to crying, more amygdala reactivity, more reported irritation, and a stronger hand grip. So that might make you wonder, how is this related to maltreatment? We do know that maltreatment measured in the family, that young infants are at increased risk. What you see here is the prevalence of infant maltreatment in the Netherlands. And on the right-hand side, you see that measured in youth until 18, around 21% of all inhabitants of the Netherlands under 18, 21% of them are between 0 and 3 years of age. But among those for whom maltreatment was reported, 41% is between 0 and 3. So there's a risk ratio of 2.6. Being between 0 and 3 is a risk for being maltreated. And crying certainly plays a role in that. For crying elicits proximity seeking. It gives information on the health condition. As we now know, higher pitch is, there is something with my health. It's thus evolutionary adaptive, but it also evokes aversion. And by the time that infants are 6 months old, over 6% of the parents admit that they have shaken their baby or slapped it or smothered it in order for the crying to stop. So we did a study in a health center, a healthcare facility, in fact, where both maltreating mothers and non-maltreating mothers with their children were included. The non-maltreating mothers had children with a problem, a learning problem or attention problems, where the children were in therapy. And there was the other group were maltreating mothers, both neglect and abuse, that had in their past experienced more childhood abuse and more depression, currently reporting more depression and anxiety, but were otherwise comparable to the other group. So same socioeconomic status, same age of the children. We found that when they were interviewed with the AI, that in the abuse group, the percentage of secure interviews was lower than in the non-abuse group, and the group with unresolved loss was higher than in the non-abuse group. And also in these groups, we asked them to squeeze the hand grip dynamometer at maximum strength and at half strength, both during baseline, during listening to infant laughter, and listening to infants crying. And what we found was that the maltreating mothers more often used excessive force, both in response to laughter and in response to crying. So all infant outings elicited more excessive force. And that was true for those mothers who were using physical abuse, but also for those who were neglectful. Moreover, when we measured their physiological reactivity to infant crying, and we did so from their saliva, we measured salivary alpha amylase during 3 bouts of listening to infant cry sounds with a baseline before and recovery phase afterwards. We found, this is about what is salivary alpha amylase. That's in fact an indirect non-invasive measure for activity of the sympathetic nervous system, the immediate stress response. It is comparable to cortisol, that is the more well-known stress hormone, but it reacts more directly. A cortisol response is visible only after 20 to 25 minutes. Alpha amylase, you can measure immediately any effects of stress. So what did we see? Maltreating mothers had a lower basal salivary alpha amylase level and also a flat response to the infant's cry compared to non-maltreating mothers who showed an increase and then a decrease when they listened to infant cry sounds. Same was true for skin conductance. So skin conductance is also a stress indicator. If you're stressed, there's more sweat, so there's more skin conductance. And the non-maltreating mothers show this profile of being distressed and then back to, well, not back to normal, but back to recovery. And in the maltreating, it is a flatter profile. Moreover, in a non-maltreating group, there was the expected negative association between heart rate and pre-ejection period that was absent in the maltreating group. So there was a dissociation of heart rate and pre-ejection period in maltreating mothers when exposed to infant cry sounds. And that may be the result of their own childhood experiences, which were in many cases not too good. So infant crying is a risk for maltreatment, as shown in a prevalence study of child maltreatment. Maltreating parents show dysregulated physiological responses to infants crying, which may be related to their own childhood experiences. Turning to neurobiology, genetics, and hormones. May it be in our genes how we react to infant cry sounds. We did a study measuring that. We examined adults' cardiac reactivity to repeated cry sounds in a genetically informative design, that is, including both monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins. Now, monozygotic twins or identical twins are in their structural DNA similar. They have the same set of genes, whereas dizygotic twins or fraternal twins are on average half. They share half of their genes on average. You get half of your genes from your mother, half from your father, and they could, in theory, you could just have the same genes and then you are similar, just as identical twins are. Or it could be that you share none of them, so that you and your sibling are completely different. But that's a bell curve, of course, and on average, it's 50%. So fraternal twins share the same amount of genes on average as normal siblings. Now, if for certain characteristics, monozygotic twins are much more similar than dizygotic twins, apparently it plays a role whether you're genetically identical or not. So then, for that characteristic, there is a high heritability factor. Heritability makes a difference for how you are in that respect. For instance, the color of your hair, or how long you are, or your BMI. Whereas if on a certain characteristic, fraternal twins and identical twins are have the same amount of similarity, so the correlation in both groups is around 0.40, then apparently it doesn't matter so much how similar you are in your genetics. And for that characteristic, you then conclude that environmental factors play a bigger role than genetic factors. So by comparing the similarity of monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins, you can conclude whether a certain characteristic or response, such as here, is more determined by genetic factors or more determined by environmental factors. And here what we found was that genes predicted 40 to 50% of the variance in heart rate, both baseline and heart rate response to infant crying. So the reactivity increased with each cry episode, and that's also our natural experience. Cry sounds that do not stop. We get more aroused every time. And that also happened here. And it was genetic factors that also explained how much we were further aroused by those bouts of infant crying. By the way, non-parents showed more cardiac reactivity than parents, and males displayed a larger increase in heart rate in response to repeated cry sounds than females. So the story that is sometimes told that men or fathers do not respond to their infants crying because they are not aroused or they don't hear it, it's not true. Be aware, be assured, they do hear it, and they do react to that, at least in their heart rate. So from the heart, we go to the hormone of oxytocin. That has hypothetical roles of sharpening emotion recognition. It lowers aversion, it elevates empathy, and may thus lead to more sensitivity. At least we found that in fathers with toddlers with and without autism spectrum disorders, who were observed twice with an intervening period of 2 weeks, and once they sniffed oxytocin and once they sniffed a placebo, they were more sensitive in the session where they had sniffed oxytocin. Might that also help in responding to infants crying? We look again at the brain responses in the fMRI scanner, listening to the cry sounds that you know by now and the control sounds. We had twin siblings, and half of the twins, adult twins, received placebo and half of the twins received oxytocin. This was our first fMRI study, and by then we thought we could not ask the subjects to go into the scanner twice. We changed. I now ask fathers to even do 3 measurements in the fMRI scanner, but then we thought we'll have the ideally matched participant for the other condition. So twin siblings, one received oxytocin, one received placebo, and they were interviewed with the adult attachment interview. But what we found was that oxytocin reduced amygdala activation to infants crying. And remember, amygdala was aversion, anxiety. So it's good if that goes down. And oxytocin increased insula and inferior frontal gyrus activation to infant crying, which is related to empathy. So the oxytocin administration led to less anxiety and aversion and more empathy. Interestingly, oxytocin downregulated the amygdala activation during infant crying, in particular in insecure adults. So here you see on the left hand those who were considered secure on the basis of their adult attachment interview, and on the right hand those who were considered insecure. And the blue bars represent the amygdala activity in the placebo condition, and the yellow one in the insecure, and the yellow one in the oxytocin condition. And what you see that for secures, there was not such a big difference between the two conditions, but for the insecures, they had the increased amygdala reactivity to crying in the placebo condition, which was much lessened in the oxytocin condition. Moreover, if we look at the squeezing the hand grip dynamometer, it was the same pattern. For secures, it did not matter so much whether they were in the oxytocin or placebo condition, but for the insecures, it did matter, and oxytocin did reduce the excessive force in the hand grip dynamometer during crying. And it was true, as you see left under half of the figure, that was true for all three insecure categories. So that's the difference between secures and insecures. So should we consider oxytocin mother's little helper, order it now and distribute on a wide scale? No, the answer is no. For oxytocin administration does not work for everyone in a similar way. And sometimes it seems that those who had untoward childhood experiences, for them it works less well than for those who had happy childhoods. So in that case, it would not help those who need it most. So in sum, reactions to infants crying are partly shaped by genetics and also affected by oxytocin. 40 to 50% of the heart rate response is due to genetic factors. And do not forget, males do react even stronger than females with their heart rate to infant crying. And oxytocin seems to lower insecure individuals' responses to crying, both their brain responses and their behavioral responses. And that brings me to the final topic, which is on a happy note. What about smiling and laughter? For infants do start out to crying. The first 6 weeks, it's mostly crying and distress. But fortunately, after 6 weeks to 8 weeks, 2 months, infants begin to smile and there is laughter. And here you see a picture from Charles Darwin's book from 1872, Expression of Emotions. He was interested in smiling and laughter too. And these are, I think, great pictures that he was interested in. He also wrote in that book, everyone knows how immoderately children laugh. And I could not resist the temptation to also let you hear some infant laughter. Yeah, that makes you happy. So infant laughter is also attachment behavior. It elicits proximity seeking. Now for interaction, you don't walk away from an infant that smiles at you. It's thus also evolutionary adaptive. It's a rewarding experience, but we know that unfortunately, it's not for all parents rewarding to a similar extent. And for instance, those parents who suffer from postnatal depression enjoy infant laughter less so than parents without postnatal depression. And we wondered whether the role of oxytocin, as we saw it in response to infants crying, might also be relevant for response to infant laughter. And the reason that we thought that is that parents with postnatal depression tend to be lower in their oxytocin levels than parents without postnatal depression. So oxytocin might also play a role in response to laughter. And that is what we found indeed. The difference between laughter and control sounds when we compared the oxytocin condition to the placebo condition was that in the oxytocin condition, there was reduced amygdala activation during laughter versus a control sound. But oxytocin also increased the connectivity between the amygdala and the neural reward regions, the OFC and the ACC. So there was a direct link that was stronger with the reward regions of the brain. So oxytocin may promote sensitivity and attachment because it reduces activity of the amygdala, so there is stress reduction, and it increases the reward value of infants' laughter. So, in sum, emotion regulation in the face of child distress, for that the optimum is in the middle. Parents should not be under-aroused, or else they do not do anything to comfort the child. But they should not be overwhelmed, for that hampers them in their response to the infant child. The normal crying curve peaks at around 2 months. Adults with an insecure attachment representation, as we measure with the help of the adult attachment interview, show stronger reactions to infants crying, both in their brain and in their reported feelings of irritation, and in their behavioral response. They more often use excessive force when exposed to infant cry sounds. Reactions to infants crying are partly shaped by genetics and are also affected by oxytocin. But the good news, infant smiling and laughter may save parents from exhaustion. I thank you for your attention, and I thank the support of especially Marinus van IJzendoorn, with whom most of these studies were conducted. I also thank the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research and the European Research Council, who granted the research that I presented here. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Marian, por tu presentación. Vamos ahora a ver las preguntas que aparezcan en la sección de preguntas. Una primera pregunta dice, de acuerdo a tu experiencia, Marian, ¿cómo reaccionan los padres, papá hombre, no la madre, a terapia familiar en el caso de maltrato? Cuando hay maltrato infantil, experiencias de trabajo con el papá, cuando pensando dice que tienen respuestas adecuadas al llanto de los bebés. Si tienes algún dato respecto del trabajo con hombres, con papás.
Yeah, the question is on the responses of fathers to infants crying, and especially in the case of abuse and family therapy of fathers who are with children who have been abused either by them or by the mother. In our healthcare facility where mothers were treated, I think 3/4 of them were without a partner. And that means that we do not have much information about fathers who are involved in a family with infant abuse related to infants crying. At the same time, I think it is telling that 3/4 of them did not have a partner. If you're a single parent and your baby cries a lot, you're definitely in a risk situation. You're at risk of being exhausted, of treating your child too hard. I think it absolutely makes evolutionary sense that we belong to the 5% of mammals where biparental care is normal. We are in that type of mammals that indeed cry with sound, with tears, with everything, and that's arousing. And you really, I would say, you need to be with 2 of them to endure that period of infant crying. Having said that, in my current studies, I focus on fathers, and we currently measure also the hormonal changes in fathers when they have their first child. So in the period that men become father for the first time, and we do see that they are affected as well. Not like mothers, where pregnancy brings about changes in hormones that are so big that they'll never experience such big changes again. But in fathers, it's more induced by what they do. The more they do with their child, the more their hormonal levels change, and also the more their brain reactivity to infant crying changes. With result from a very recent study, we're actually writing down the results now, where the hours that fathers spend in childcare in the first 2 months are related to how they respond to infant crying. So it is not that you're born with a brain that is open or is not open to infant cry sounds, but the more you do with your child, the more adaptive your system becomes to responding to infants' signals and also infant crying. So what could that mean for therapy? Parenting support can be extremely important in a period of having your first baby, especially if it is a crying baby. Being more with your infant makes things easier, but sometimes you're overwhelmed and you need a break. And especially for single parents, it can be urgent to take care of someone who can take care of the baby while the parent takes a break.
Gracias, Marian. Hay otra pregunta, dice, ¿podrá ser que los adultos con apego inseguro tengan una menor producción de oxitocina?
That's a good question. Let me think whether I know something about that. I know something that is related. It's not about adult attachment interview, which is a reflection on your own childhood experiences, but we do know from a recent meta-analysis that is open access, published in Clinical Psychological Review with Bruce Ellis as the first author, that adverse childhood experiences are related to lower basal levels of oxytocin. Mm-hmm. And that is true both in children and in adults. Interestingly, though, that is most strongly so not in the clinical groups, but in the normal range. So in clinical groups, we tend to see no association anymore between the adverse childhood experiences within that group, which may be because they are all on a very high level, so there's no variance anymore. But in a clinical group, it may also be overruled by medication that people get. In the normal range, more childhood adversity is related to lower oxytocin levels.
Y en la misma línea preguntan, aparte de tocar, jugar o reír con el bebé, ¿cómo pueden los padres incrementar su nivel de oxitocina para tener mejores, con los papás con apego inseguro, ¿cierto? Para tener mejores interacciones con sus hijos?
Yeah. We do think that physical contact may play a role. There are some studies on infant massage that show an increase of oxytocin both in the baby and in the parent. So that may actually be a very efficient intervention, because both profit, both are benefited, both the child and the infant and the parent. We are involved in a study with fathers where we introduced a soft baby carrier in a randomized control trial and an infant seat in the control group, to see whether also in fathers infant carrying increases their oxytocin levels. We do not know the results yet, but we do find a correlation between numbers of hours that the infant carrier has been used, and we measure that with a thermologger, so that we really know it was used during those hours, and observed sensitivity after 2 months. So we do see a link between the two, but at this point in time, I do not know whether that's also the result of the randomized control trial. So whether it may be that carrying more leads to more sensitivity, or sensitivity leads to more carrying. And we're awaiting the oxytocin results. We have done one study even with a chair cover, so a mechanical massage, and that also increases oxytocin levels.
Y luego hay una pregunta que dice, en relación al tipo de respuesta al llanto, usted señaló que lo ideal sería una respuesta intermedia, ¿cierto? No una sobrereacción ni una falta de respuesta. ¿Podría especificar mejor ese punto, por favor, específicamente sobre el tiempo de respuesta y el tipo de reacción verbal y no verbal?
Yeah. What I meant with the curvy linear association was between arousal and response. You cannot give the best response if you're under aroused or over aroused. If you're under aroused, you do nothing. If you're over aroused, you're just busy stopping the infant crying because of your own arousal, and not because you think the baby needs that. So if you're over aroused, you cannot be sensitive anymore, because you're not open anymore to what the child needs, but to your own needs. In terms of an optimum in verbal and physical responses to an infant crying, most important is to have a divergent response to the crying of an infant that is urgent, that needs direct response, or the crying of a baby, for instance, that is tired and will fall asleep in 5 minutes, also if you do nothing. So the sensitive parent can distinguish between the two. In one of our studies, we had parents listening to infant cry sounds, and they were accompanied by a message. This child is bored, or this child is ill. And we found that after oxytocin administration, parents' brain regions reacted stronger when the same cry sound was accompanied by the message, this baby is ill, and less reactive to the same cry sound when it was accompanied by this baby is bored. So it is this being able to match your response to what is needed in the moment that is optimal.
Y la última pregunta, hay muchas, Marian, pero por tiempo no podemos verlas todas. Rodrigo Cárcamo pregunta si es que hay resultados de intervención con la muñeca esta Liza que usaban para evaluar sensibilidad, ¿cierto? Para regular la respuesta de los adultos al llanto, si se han utilizado ese tipo de dispositivos en intervención.
Yeah, we have used the doll, but mostly for observation. And not for intervention. For instance, one of our newest interventions, we used a video feedback intervention to promote positive parenting, but then prenatally for fathers using ultrasound so that they could interact with their baby while the baby was still unborn. And we wanted to have an assessment of parental sensitivity both before and after birth, before the intervention started. And we wanted to know the effects of that intervention on postnatal sensitivity. So that's a situation where we needed the Lissa, the doll, to measure prenatal sensitivity, then in a control and experimental group, giving the prenatal video feedback, and then assessing postnatal sensitivity. And we're finalizing the analysis. It seems that the intervention indeed has an effect in increasing sensitivity. So 3 sessions of an extra ultrasound and stimulating already prenatal interaction between the father and the infant may boost their involvement and sensitivity after the birth of the baby.
Muchas gracias, Marian. Es muy interesante, la verdad. Veo acá los comentarios en el chat que la gente está muy, muy contenta y muy agradecida de tu presentación. Aprovecho de recordarle a las personas que van a ir a la próxima conferencia de que si bien Zoom está programado a las 10, la conferencia parte a las 10:15, ¿ya? Para que puedan participar en ella. Bueno, Marian, muchas gracias por tu presentación y por tu participación este día. Que tengas una buena tarde y un buen fin de semana.
Thank you so much, and have a great